Primary and secondary sources in World War II. How do we learn about history? Because history happens in the past, we need to rely on various sources in order to understand and interpret history. The sources are separated into two categories: primary sources, such as this newspaper, and secondary sources, such as a depiction of a battle. We know one of the basic definitions of primary is immediate or direct. What that means is that in historical context, a primary source is one which links us directly to the past, a source which is connected directly with a period of time or event. So let's say, for our purposes, history is a tall building. Present day is at the top, and the foundation of the building is the event we are studying. That is where we will find primary sources. So we could say primary sources are the foundation of history. Let's take a look at some primary sources from World War II. Such primary sources can be images like you see here, photos, paintings, or drawings such as maps. Other drawings such as propaganda and political cartoons might be considered primary or secondary. If we are looking for factual information about World War II causes, we might consider this secondary, but if we are looking for feelings or opinions held during this time, these would be considered primary. Newspapers from that time period could also be considered primary sources. Of course, first-hand accounts from people who were at the event are primary sources and can either be written on audio tape or on videotape. Other primary sources could be artifacts from the time period, such as machineries like the planes that you see, dog tags, passports or identity cards from the people who carried them around at that time, and medals from that time period. So if primary sources are the foundation, then secondary sources can be considered the floors above the foundation that use the primary sources as their basis for historical content. Secondary sources are the sources that are removed from the period or event. Secondary sources from World War II might include the following: museums that might house primary sources, but in general tell the story and from a secondary point of view. Monuments that might pay tribute to the men and women in the war or a particular battle would be a secondary source. Here we see a poster of the planes of World War II, not the actual planes, but recreations as drawings. Movies that depict World War II, such as The Dirty Dozen or Schindler's List, are also secondary sources. They do provide insight into World War II, but are fictional, and as such are not primary sources of information, even if they used primary sources as research material. Textbooks and other history books could be considered secondary sources depending on when and by whom they were written. A biography of a general would be secondary, but an autobiography would be primary. Looking back at these sources, we see that viewing the primary sources as our foundation of historical knowledge and context allows us to base our understanding of history on the strongest pieces of evidence we have. So while some primary sources, such as this map, registration card, and tobacco ticket, are some of the best evidence of what was happening during World War II, some drawbacks of primary sources include determining whether or not the source is truly primary, difficult in finding primary sources, and interpreting the context of the source. Secondary sources, such as these propaganda materials, are important because they add color to historical events and allow for an increase in material to research. The concern with secondary sources are that we need to ascertain any bias. We need to know why this source was created and what point it is trying to make. Secondary sources can be used in conjunction with primary sources to aid this understanding. Provided we can ascertain legitimacy and context of these sources, both primary and secondary sources can be used together to create a full picture of history and be a valuable tool to further our understanding of history and historical events.